Hey, I'm Dr. Dave Harrison, and I want to welcome you to this series of videos on television and video production. We're talking about the video camera right now and specifically discussing lenses in this particular video. What does a lens do? One of the most important things that a lens does is it zooms, or if we want to be really technical, it changes the focal length of the lens. In other words, it allows us to zoom in very telephoto, or very tight, or very zoomed in, or it allows us to zoom out to a nice wide shot. It really helps us to get things that are far away, almost like a telescope. The other thing that it does is it does focus, which adjusts the focus point. What the focus point is the distance between the camera and the subject. That distance is what is going to be sharply in focus. There's markings on the lens, I'll show you in just a second. But what that does is it allows us to ensure that the audience is looking at exactly what we want them to look at. Focus on specifically what we want them to focus on. Another main aspect of what a lens does is it controls iris, which is a change in aperture, which is one of the things that affects exposure, one of the main things that affects exposure. We can reduce the amount of light going through the lens, or we can increase the amount of light going through the lens to make it so that the camera can pull off a proper exposure. One of the things that's important is the concept of depth of field. I have an image right here where I've got this nice flower that's in focus. I've got the background that's completely soft. It's out of focus. What this does is it's because the depth of field is set so that only the rows will be in focus. The depth of field may be just a few inches in this case, and everything that's outside of that depth of field is going to be soft. Everything that's inside the depth of field is going to be nice and crisp and in focus. So the definition becomes that distance in front of the subject, or between the subject and the camera, that's acceptably in focus, and on the far side, the distance between the camera and the subject that's on the far side, which is acceptably in focus. So that distance from near to far is going to be that depth of field. It's affected by the lens focal length, or the zoom, which we just barely talked about. It's also affected by the exposure, or when I say exposure, I really mean the iris setting or the aperture setting. That's one of the main things, but we'll talk more about depth of field in another video. It's going to be shallow depth of field when the lens is zoomed in. So in this particular case, we've got the camera zoomed in to make it so that there's limited depth of field, which gives us that nice soft look in the background. Lastly, I want to talk about other lens settings. Here's a particular lens. Actually, I'll go over the rings on this particular lens. We've got the focus ring right here. It's a nice big ring. It's got the whole grip right in here. And then we have markings on here, right here, 0.8, that's meters. We've got 3 feet, so it's set in meters and in feet for you international people and for you American people. It has those different settings. That's between the camera pickup, which is going to be about right here, and the subject that would become the focal point with those particular markings. Next ring in is going to be this zoom ring. This is marked in focal length in millimeters. So I've got 80 millimeters, 40 millimeters, and so forth. That's the markings on the lens. So as I rotate that, it's going to change the focal length. It's going to zoom in more telephoto, or it's going to zoom out more of a wide angle. I also have a lens servo, or a zoom servo. I can push this button back, that's going to go more wide. I can push this switch more forward, and that's going to zoom in. And that's especially when I'm working handheld, I can zoom out and zoom in by just touching the buttons on this particular zoom servo. I also have the iris right here. We can tell it's the iris because it's set off in f-stops, 2.8, 4, 5.6, 8, 11, and so forth. All of those are f-stops. We can change this, rotate it, make it so that less light is coming through the lens or more light is coming through the lens. And then on this particular, I've got the extender. Right here, there's a switch that we can move this down. Right here, it says 1x. And if I move it down, it says 2x. What that's going to do is it's going to put an additional lens element inside the lens, which is going to double the factor of the focal length. So if I've got it set on 80 millimeters and I flip this switch down to the 2x, it's going to multiply that by 2, and it's going to be 160 millimeters, which is going to be much more zoomed in. Then I also have the macro on this particular lens. It's marked with an M. I would pull this little switch out, and that would allow me to rotate this, which is going to allow me to adjust the macro setting, which allows me to focus on things that are very close to the lens. I could actually focus on things that are just in front of the lens, which allows me to get nice miniature things like maybe diamond rings or maybe little bugs in nature, something like that. That's what the macro setting allows me to do. And lastly, I have the back focus. It's actually the same ring as the macro, but the back focus right here, I would have to loosen this and then I'd be able to adjust this entire ring. The back focus ensures that the lens is going to be in focus or on the same focal point through the entire zoom of the lens. So for every focal length of the lens, I stay on the same focal distance, meaning the same focus. So if I have this set for, say, 3 feet, I zoom the lens all the way out, I zoom the lens all the way in. I always ensure that I have that focus point right there set at 3 feet. That will only happen as long as the back focus is set correctly. The back focus will be set at the beginning of a shoot to ensure that it's set correctly for the rest of the shoot, and you may have to adjust that as needed throughout the shoot. What is this thing called exposure? Well, we know that things can control exposure, the iris setting, the aperture, the amount of light through the lens. The shutter, meaning the amount of time that each frame is being exposed to light. And finally, lighting. So as we look at this particular image, we see this is a little bit overexposed, and we may have a little bit of underexposure down here. But really, we've got a nice amount of range from brightest to darkest areas of this image, and we have quite a bit of different values of light that are here, and this really would be a proper exposure. Now, exposure is very subjective, but the key to a good videographer is the ability to control that subjectivity and allow his or her own artistry to be allowed into that particular setting. I want to let you know that this series of videos on television and video production is extensive. We have a lot of videos. You can look to our channel for playlists and additional videos. I invite you to subscribe, and then also do visit our Patreon page and become a patron of our channel to allow more videos like this to be produced. I am Dr. Dave Harris, and I thank you for your support.